Hello, and welcome to our training on identifying victims at high risk for homicide. This is domestic violence victims who may be at a higher risk than others to be a victim of homicide. This is intended for service providers that work in agencies specifically dedicated to working with domestic violence victims and survivors. And the training today is presented by MUJER and by the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence. So I will go over the objectives for today. By the end of this training, we hope you will have gained some useful information and knowledge about service screening protocols and best practices in terms of when to screen for risk and extreme danger, and the different steps of the risk and safety assessment and the risk factors that are tied to homicide risk, the safety planning, what to do in case of immediate danger, and then the services and referrals for people that are identified as being at high risk, the importance of regular safety check follow-ups, updating the safety plan, and when to close the case. And finally, we'll end with some useful resources for more information on domestic violence and identifying victims at high risk of homicide. So we want to share some best practices, and part of what that entails is asking safety questions throughout the whole process. And this starts at the very beginning, at the pre-screening. This is the first contact of a client with an agency. And we're sharing the example of the MUJER pre-screening form, that besides basic information about the client and the reason for their visit, there's questions about immediate safety concerns. So there's a question about experiencing physical violence at the moment and asking for the information of the perpetrator. And the client may or may not be ready to disclose that, but it's asked from the very beginning. Do you need to speak to someone immediately about something affecting you emotionally? Many times victims are not fully aware of the implications of anxiety and depression and how that is linked to fear due to domestic violence. Asking the clients, do you have a safe place to go? Do you need to leave an unsafe situation? Are you or your children experiencing sexual violence? Are children experiencing violence? Asking these questions up front give people who are ready to ask for help the opportunity to disclose this up front. We'll talk later about other ways to ask throughout the whole process. It's important, though, when you are asking these questions, that you make the client aware about mandatory reporting. So many of you, based on your roles in your agencies, you may be in a mandatory reporting role, so that if they disclose that there are children who have been victims of violence or witnessed violence, you have no choice but to report that to the authorities, to the Department of Children and Families. And it's important that they understand that implication before answering the questions about violence. Serving domestic violence victims and survivors is about empowerment, is about letting them know that they have choices and that they are in control. So it's important to let them know that certain disclosures will lead to making a report to DCF. So make sure that you refer to the mandatory reporting policy in your agency and that you're clear about when you need to report, if there's an immediate threat, not an immediate threat, and the different ways to report. So there's things to keep in mind when you are asking these questions, whether you're asking them directly or through a form. And Clotilde will talk a little bit about this.
Thank you so much. I'm Clotilde Picard. We're going to use the specific example of the client specialist that MUJER uses, who is the first person who comes in contact with the client when they come in for service. So as the client specialist gives the client the pre-screening form, there are certain things that they must be paying attention to that is occurring simultaneously. And there's a lot of body language, a lot of nonverbal communication that comes across that is related to the situation at hand and to the intake environment. So as you're observing the client filling out the pre-screening form that Marilena was talking about, take a look at who is accompanying this client. Is it a family member? Is it a spouse? Is the client accompanied by children, a neighbor, an in-law, a member of the community? What is their interaction? Would it be warranted for you to provide a separate space for the client to fill out the form in privacy so that they could spend more time answering the questions and do so honestly without the fear or the threat of having somebody else looking at what they're filling out? You might be able to provide other information for the accompanying member. You could maybe address the children and ask them questions or give them a coloring book or something to read, just to provide the opportunity for the client to dig into the information that is being requested and to provide as accurate as possible the information so that you could provide further services. Once you have that pre-screening form filled out, you will need to look at the results, and if there is any yes replies to the questions, a risk and safety assessment form must be filled out. And a risk and safety assessment form is something that MUJER has as a tool that helps you to navigate what is the current situation that the client is confronting. If you do not have this tool, we are providing a hard copy within the package that you will receive, and you could use the one provided to create your own. It is important to remember that in this case, this particular tool is not given to the client. Instead, either a care coordinator or a victim advocate, if they're available, and if they're not, a case manager or a qualified staff member will sit down with the client and hold a conversation where they will inquire about the questions that are included within this assessment tool. And this is a fantastic tool for you, not only to retrieve information from the client, but also to provide the client with a clear indication of at what level of danger their situation is putting them in, and their children, if they have any. Now, it is of utmost important to remember that if there is any yes reply to the pre-screening form, this risk assessment tool must be filled out before the client leaves the center. So basically, the risk assessment tool is trying to determine if any of the 15 high-risk factors that experience has shown are present when somebody experiences physical harm or homicide due to domestic violence are present or not. So the fact that the client has one or two of these risks does not automatically mean that they are at high risk of harm or homicide. But as they accumulate, they're more likely to be victims or be vulnerable to homicide or harm, physical harm. And what we're looking for here is any kind of indication that the client perceives their situation to be one of harm or death. We're trying to determine if the couple has problems with their custody of children. So do they have an acrimonious battle going on with the custody or the visitation or the child support of minors? If the woman is pregnant or has recently given birth within the past 18 months, studies have shown that this is a time where they are very vulnerable for any kind of physical harm. Is there a pattern of escalation where there's repeat victimization and they make up and then it escalates again and the person is re-victimized? Are there community issues? Is the client isolated? that also is something that should cause you reason to pause and probe deeper to determine if they are at risk. Stalking behavior, sexual assault, strangulation or choking, credible threats, and the use of weapons or the accessibility to weapons are factors that put the victim at very high risk of harm or homicide. So if the victim relays that they have or they're going through that kind of situation, you should dig deeper, ask further questions, get more information. And there is another tool that you can use then to determine the level of lethality. Controlling or excessive behavior, jealousy on the part of the perpetrator, and jealousy not only towards a significant other, but jealousy against the family because they spend too much time, the victim spends too much time with the family or with the children, any type of jealousy. Child abuse, animal or pet abuse are said to be correlated when it comes to domestic violence. So there are instances, the studies have shown that where there is domestic violence, there is child abuse or pet abuse, and where there is pet abuse or child abuse, there is domestic violence. Alcohol or drug abuse, instances where boundaries are broken, mental health issues, threats of suicide that could be accompanied with threats of homicide, or just suicide alone should be a sign, a warning sign that the client could be in danger. Because even though the perpetrator has not said that they will kill them, the fact that they're expressing that they're willing to die could put the victim at risk. So what happens when we confront a situation where the client presents any of these signs? First of all, we're having a conversation. And as we're having the conversation, we're doing the risk assessment. We will tally the score and show the client so that the client can have a tangible idea of the level of threat or the level of risk that they're undergoing under the current circumstances. Aside from that, aside from the risk and safety assessment form, there is also a form called the lethality indicator checklist that must be completed. And this is another form that is completed by the staff as they are holding a conversation with the client. Once again, I must stress that by this point, the client must have been warned that you are a mandatory reporter, which means that any kind of information that they provide related to child abuse or domestic violence in front of children, you will have to notify the proper authorities. So if you have the high risk assessment and you go ahead and use the lethality indicator checklist, this will put you at a position to be able to educate the client, and it will also give you the opportunity to make them aware of their situation and of possible actions that they can take to keep safe and to keep their children, if they have any, safe as well. This is the lethality indicator checklist. It's a document that MUJER uses. And if you do not have one within your agency, you will be provided a copy of MUJER's lethality indicator checklist, and you can use it to create your own. Now, this instrument has been done using experience, past experience with domestic violence victims who have been harmed or who have been, unfortunately, victims of homicide at the hands of their abuser. Studies that have been conducted have also supported the evidence that we see here. So these are signs that will help you to identify imminent risk, imminent danger, and it will provide you and afford you the opportunity to educate the client and to create an action plan. What are we looking for? As we said before, when we were discussing the high risk indicators, any suicidal thoughts, we're looking for any kind of emotional decompensation where the the abuser seems to be in a position of creating harm and willing to create harm to himself or herself, because the abuser is not just male, it could be female, and would be willing to create harm to the victim or the children or other family members. Ownership or centrality of the victim to perpetrator. Is the victim being viewed as an object with extreme jealousy? Are there boundaries that have been crossed? Is the victim isolated and thus depressed? They don't see any way out. Is there antisocial behavior? Is there failure of community control, lack of contact with other community members? Is there severity of violence? Are there other factors? If there are items that you do not see within the lethality indicator checklist, you have a space available for notes that you can use to add anything else that the client provides that would help you to identify whether the case in front of you is one where this person could be killed at the hand of their abusers. And it would afford you the opportunity to take appropriate action to put them in a position of safety by creating a safety plan. And I'm going to pass the baton on to Maria Elena to discuss the safety plan process. Thank you.
Thank you, Clotilde. So I'm going to talk about safety planning. So those of you who work in domestic violence regularly and have experience in the field, I'm sure you're familiar with a safety plan. Every victim and survivor is asked to think about what they would do if they face danger again, if they face the abuser, how they would stay safe, what kinds of things they need. So we're going to review that briefly, but also thinking about what this means for somebody at extreme risk, at risk for homicide based on the research-based risk factors that were identified in the safety checks. So the important thing about the safety plan is that it's tailored to every client individually. It's going to be based on their specific situation, the people they live with, the things they're concerned about, the places where they move, and the options that they have, and the level of fear or risk that they have, right? So that applies to everybody. And that often includes thinking ahead about what they need for their well-being, packing a go-away bag in case things get so bad that they need to leave the house in a hurry. That includes things like personal documents, medical records, educational records, contact information for people they might need, and money. It can also mean thinking ahead of who should be contacted, or a way to let someone know that there's a crisis or that there's danger, whether it's a code word to a friend through a text or some sort of message to a neighbor, so that they know to call the police or to know that a crisis is happening. Talking to children about what to do in case violence happens again. For all victims of domestic violence, or everybody receiving services for domestic violence, there should be a safety plan. And often that also includes emotional safety, what to do if you have a panic attack, if you encounter the abuser, those kinds of things. So this is just, again, a sample of the guidelines that MUJER uses for their safety plan. And it has to do with what to do in case of having to leave the house, similar as you might have a plan in case of a fire or some other emergency, thinking of a safe place to go, what things you will need, who you would contact, and all those things. And on the right side of your screen, you'll see the kinds of things a survivor could need and might want to put in a bag in case they have to leave in an emergency. Nothing is 100%. There's always things that you can't anticipate, but the idea of safety planning and crisis planning, or planning for an emergency, is thinking ahead of what could happen, what could be some worst case scenarios, and making sure that there's a plan in place to respond, and that in the middle of the crisis, the victim and the family don't have to start thinking about what to do. So here's an example of the components of a crisis safety plan, something to be used for people who are identified at particularly high risk. And even if they've left the home, they may still be at risk, right? The perpetrator may still be trying to find them. So thinking of the types of things that have worked in the past to keep them safe, where they've gone, and things that they've said that have helped keep them safe. Maybe a crisis line that they can call, maybe a police officer that they've been in touch with before. Also, again, thinking about the emotional safety, right? In the case that I perhaps have an anxiety attack or I'm not thinking straight, here's things that have helped me. Here's a list of things that I can do to help me concentrate on getting out of this crisis. If I have to go to the emergency room, what emergency room would I go to? If you will need medical attention, what do you have to think about? Are you allergic to any medications? What do people need to know? What are your preferences for treatment if you are injured? What can the staff do to help you? If you call them in the case of an emergency and tell them just a few things, what else do they need to know? Do they know who to call? Who else can give you support? Where you live? Where to pick up your children? Things like that. So thinking ahead, if the worst, if something very violent and extreme were to happen, do the right people have the information that they need to help? People to call for support and their contact information, because in an emergency, you may not have your phone with you, right? So who you want contacted if you were to be hospitalized. Things that need attention if you have pets or someone else that relies on you for something, right? And you might not be able to do it if an emergency ensues. Thinking about all those things ahead, first, it provides tools for dealing with an emergency where it's happened, right? And the idea is that then this plan is copied and provided to, the staff, but also other family members or people who might help in a crisis. But also it can help the victim think through the level of risk and anticipate things that could put them in danger. There's some situations that are known to put people at higher risk for extreme violence, and situations of domestic violence related homicide are more likely to occur in these contexts than others. So for example, when the perpetrator was just released on bail, even if there's a restraining order, they might feel the need to get back at the person who put them in jail. When they're first served with a restraining order, they might feel that their power and control is being taken away and turn particularly violent. When family court decisions are announced about child custody or divorce or child support, when the victim first leaves, so sometimes that can be the most dangerous time when somebody is most likely to become extremely violent. When the victim takes the children from the home, that can also make the perpetrator feel that they're losing control and that they need to exert power. Also, we've heard from survivors that encountering the perpetrator in court during the mandatory kind of court hearings has made them feel very unsafe, have felt intimidated, that the perpetrator might try to find them in the hallway. So thinking ahead of those things and how to plan to feel safe. So to prevent injury and harm, and also to increase a sense of safety. This often includes notifying other people, notifying third parties. So that could include security guards at work or in the apartment complex where you live. Those people may know the spouse, the perpetrator, and they don't know the details, and they can let them in. Neighbors or workers around the apartment complex, they may not know what's going on, and the perpetrator can come up and strike up a conversation. So sometimes you need to let others know that that person is not welcome, that you consider them a risk. Friends that don't know the situation could also be contacted and might inadvertently reveal the victim's whereabouts. So that's something else to think through in the safety plan. Who needs to be notified? that the perpetrator is considered a high risk and should not be put in contact with the family. So this safety check is not something that happens just once. It's something that it needs to be recurring until the risk level comes down. So Clotilde will talk a little bit more about follow-up safety checks.
Thank you, Maria Elena. So as Maria Elena said, when you're assessing for high risk of lethality, when you're assessing for high risk of harm, it is an ongoing process. Every time that you see the victim, you need to reassess the situation. Have things changed? Are things better? Are things worse? Whatever the situation might be, if the situation has changed, has shifted, you will need to fill out the proper forms again. And you will also need to address the safety plan. So maybe when you saw the victim before, they were at a level that, yes, they were afraid, but they were not planning on moving. Now they come to you and they say, I am very much afraid that he's going to hurt me tonight. I cannot go home. So things must be changed. New measures must be taken. And you need to work that out with the client. So once again, you will fill out the proper forms. You will sit with them and try to assess what is the level of risk. And based on the level of risk, what should be the safety measures that should fall in place. If nothing has changed, you should have, as common practice, a specific date that once a month, you will go ahead and conduct the evaluation. So you might not see the client for 2 months, but at least monthly, you will reach out and determine what is their current status. So yes, we're suggesting when you come in contact with them, assess the situation. But if you're not going to see them for a prolonged period of time, it is a good practice to at least monthly conduct the evaluation, reach out and conduct the evaluation. So if the person, because remember that what we're doing here is assessing high risk for harm or homicide. So based on the assessments that you have conducted, the person is at a very high risk. In order to receive the services that the person needs, police reporting is not mandatory. So if the client does not want to report the case to the police for whatever reason, make them aware that they can still receive the appropriate services, legal services, they can still receive emotional services, psychological services, housing, food-related services. So all those services are available whether or not they decide to report the incident to the police. If they do decide that they want to take this forward and present a complaint before the police, let them know that you can assist them in that process, okay? So that they can get that going as well. So even though we're mentioning here case managers, because we're mentioning specific roles that are played within MUJER, this has to do with specific staff members that come in contact with the client when they're coming in for services. So as I said before, you're constantly updating that safety plan based on the assessment. So if the risk assessment changes, the safety plan must be updated as well. We cannot forget that. So if maybe the risk has heightened, so the safety measures will be heightened as well. So there's a correlation between one and the other. And as you did before, if you do the monthly risk assessments, then you'll do the monthly safety changes that go along with it. And who are the staff members that we are talking about here when we refer to maybe a case manager, when we refer to an advocate? What do we mean? I'm going to let Maria Elena go ahead and explain the different roles that different members could play in putting a victim at a safe spot.
Thank you, Clotilde. So we've talked about different roles and different names of positions, and that's really a little bit of semantics, and every organization has their own staffing pattern and their own job descriptions. But I want to talk a little bit about the different roles to emphasize how important it is for everybody in the system to be trained in identifying victims at extremely high risk. Usually there's a case manager that assigned cases to a caseworker, care coordinator, victim advocate, and maybe opens the case, assigns it to a grant, maybe does the administrative paperwork and closes cases officially and things like that. Their main role may not be one-on-one with the clients, but it's important that this person be trained just as everyone else in these safety assessments, so that they can be, in the case that a care coordinator or victim advocate is not available at the time, the case manager can jump in and do the assessments and take action in case that immediate action is needed. Usually, in terms of working directly with the client, we have care coordinators and victim advocates. Typically, care coordinators are focused on the social well-being of the victim and the family, and trying to refer them to mental health services, maybe housing assistance, help them set goals for what they want to achieve, any kind of school support, medical support. They can guide them in the steps needed to be taken for the different restraining orders. And because they have frequent contact with the client, it's important that they be hyper aware of who is at high risk and what risk factors could be changing that could place the person at a higher risk. Victim advocates are typically more focused on the legal side of things. So they might accompany the client to court, help them with legal paperwork for the restraining orders, and also make referrals to social services such as shelters and housing, and helping with police reports. Again, even though they may refer primarily to, or that their tasks are mostly about the legal side, they should also have this training and ensure that they will be able to recognize when risk factors change, and that they can jump into action if a client is deemed to be at particularly high risk. In some organizations, sexual assault is a separate program. Some organizations do both domestic violence and sexual violence. The sexual violence staff also need to be aware. As we have discussed in other trainings, there's a lot of overlap between sexual assault, family violence, domestic violence, and power and control of a perpetrator over a victim. So the same dynamics that can end up in a very dangerous situation that could end in homicide exist in the world of sexual assault, just the same as domestic violence. Many agencies also refer to mental health therapists. Hopefully, some of this is part of their training, but some therapists may not specialize in domestic violence. So when you do work with therapists that may not have this awareness, maybe share with them the lethality assessment, share with them the protocol of your organization to identify people at high risk, and so that it can be a collective action, and with several people ready to jump in and understand the risk and know what the services are. So in terms of services, when someone is deemed a very high risk, it often means removing, relocating them, and so it has to do with housing. Many times that's the initial move. Sometimes it involves the police or a restraining order. But somebody that's high risk for homicide should still be referred to the services that you would refer to them anyway. They should receive assistance with the court system, have referrals for mental health or physical health, support groups, and any other social services, with a heightened awareness that they may be at extreme risk, and making sure that everybody in that system is aware of these, right? Because what we're trying to achieve is to reduce the number of domestic violence related homicides. And instead of having to look back and say what could have been done, learn from the research and from the tragedies that have occurred and intervene at the different places. So the purpose is just to refresh that awareness that we all need to be alert to identify these risks that place some people at a higher risk for homicide. Finally, you have to decide when to close the case. Cases that are at risk for homicide might take a little longer to close because they will continue until that risk level is deemed acceptable. And perhaps that's going to require more intense services in terms of, housing and court proceedings and mental health, right? But the level of risk should be lowered to an acceptable rate before closing. There's many reasons to close because people stop coming, but as long as the client is willing, they should remain kind of being monitored and their safety being checked to prevent any domestic violence related homicide. So before we close, we want to make sure that you have the phone numbers for domestic violence resources nationally and in our area. If you ever encounter a situation where somebody might be at extreme risk and are not sure what to do, you can call these numbers and get help, get guidance. You can refer to some of the experts at MUJER and Homestead Police Department's SOS program locally in South Dade. And yeah, if you see something and you're worried about someone's safety, always better to take action and communicate with others and really try to help the victim understand that they may be at heightened risk. Here's some additional domestic violence resources on the web that you can go to for more information on screening and services and preventing extreme violence. Thank you very much for participating in this training. This is a very important issue that requires vigilance and raising awareness with everyone that might come into contact with a victim. So your comments and your feedback are really important to us. We look forward to getting your questions, and thank you very much for your attention today. Again, on behalf of MUJER and the Florida Coalition Against Domestic Violence, we thank you for being part of our training today.